There you go. And so Genesis is a theological text. And so when we're reading through the scriptures at each point and at each juncture, to be able to, when we're talking about the text, to see what is this text trying to tell us about God? Now, what is this text trying to tell us about the way God participates with humans? What is it trying to tell us about the nature of God, the character of God? What is it trying to tell us about the nature of between God and human beings? And for those of you that are in BLE, that you'll know that these are some of the questions that come up when we're talking through our theological process and developing a theology. And that's because that the Bible is trying to do something, do a kind of project that goes beyond just trying to state certain facts. That again, instead of just getting pure facts, God is nice, God is perfect, God is gentle, God likes to eat ice creams on Thursday nights. Like we don't get those kinds of things. What we do get is a story about how God interacts with human beings, which again is trying to tell us something about the nature of God through these through the narrative devices that we see within the text. And so that's why, again, that when we're looking at narratives, to be able to see certain certain features that are common to narratives and seeing what ways are is the text either trying to display or trying to convey something about God, and also trying to convey something about the world around us, about human beings, about all kinds of things through the use of narrative. So when we come over to Genesis, what we do find again, that in not just the attempt to be theological, but in the work of being theological, that there is going to be devices that are being used that help us to make sense of the text. And one of them being poetry. And so with the way that Genesis is often set up is going to be using poetry, and a lot of other places are going to be using poetry as well. The Psalms use it a lot. Moses is going to use it in Exodus. A lot of sayings that come up, like Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel, are going to be told in poetic form. But what we find in Genesis 1 specifically is the way that the text is being set up. Because the way it's set up is that it's not in chronological order, which you'll see in the next slide. Because again, when you try to make sense of this as a scientific text or as a historical text, it's just some parts aren't going to make sense. Is how does God create light before he's creating stars in the sun? And so again, it's because of what the text is trying to say about the way God is ordering and establishing order in creation. So with days 1, 2, and 3, if you want to think of it like a house, that what God is doing, he's laying the foundation and building the frames. That would make no sense that if you're building a house to just put a bunch of furniture on a plot of land and then try to figure it out afterwards. And so what God is doing again is setting up the frame and the foundation for those who will inhabit those specific places. So you can think sky, earth, and water that God is building. And that's what, so for the first 3 days, you're going to have a kind of frame that God is building. He's building the habitats. And for the next 3 days, he's going to build the inhabitants, including sun, the moon. You're going to have birds, you're going to have fish, and also you're going to have land animals and humanity. But you're also going to have here man and woman, male and female, being created specifically in Genesis 1. And that at the end of it, on the seventh day, God is going to rest. And what that means, again, in a text where it's trying to be theological, what it's trying to communicate to us is that God is not just resting in terms of taking a day off because he's worked so hard, but that God is now sitting on his throne overlooking his kingdom, his territory, which is the heavens and the earth. And so again, this next slide of what I'm sharing with you guys is essentially a summary of what I had just mentioned, that on the second half of day 6, that human beings are going to be tasked with being kings and queens, priests and priests of Yahweh or on God's behalf. And this is going to be important to remember as we talk about Genesis 3. The human beings are being tasked to rule over creation on Yahweh's behalf as a representative. This is what it means to be in the image of God. that having a responsibility to be a representative, having a responsibility to be a representative, having a responsibility to be a representative. That's what what it means to be made in the image. And so once the heavens and the earth are completed, again, Yahweh is going to rest. Why? Because he's the ultimate king. And the Psalms of different places will describe the heavens and the earth as a kind of footstool, a kind of throne room where God is sitting and overlooking. And so again, that you have from Genesis 1 and 2, this description of God as king and ruler over all creation, with humanity, the images of humanity co-ruling under God's care, under God's rule, and being the extension of God in the world. Are there any questions? Questions, comments, concerns so far? Again, either throw it in the chat or lift up your voice.
Would
Go ahead.
Would sort of the different perspectives of like the way people look at creation, do all of them sort of blanketly like agree that yes, the like these sort of things are theological? Because I know there's like literalists who are like, no, like he did this on this day, and it just means that he did that, you know. So is that something that all of them recognize? Like all the views that we're going to look at, like that they recognize, or is it something they don't?
Yeah. Who's they?
Like the different kinds of like theologies on the way that people look at Genesis. People like creationists, like
okay.
People think it's like stuff like that.
Yeah. So a lot of it is going to depend on the angle that people come in with, because there's going to be a lot of assumptions that there's baggage that people carry to the text, that unless all these things are scientifically provable, which a lot of them are, but unless that's the primary thing, then you can debunk the Bible, which I don't think it's necessarily true. Why? Because for early Hebrews and Israelites, that their concern isn't to write a science textbook. Their concern is to make sense in which the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has established order and established himself as king over the universe. And one of the ways he does it, in contrast to other ancient cosmologies or other ancient beginning stories, is through telling that it was God by himself that created. He didn't need any help. He didn't have to procreate with other deities. And so again, when you guys are taking your cultures class, you'll go through that more in depth, and in Pentateuch we go through it more in depth. But that the story that the Bible is trying to tell is one specifically about a God who's intimately involved with creation, and that he has no rival and no equal, that he's got that in terms of creating in Genesis 1 and 2, that what the poetry is trying to tell us, if we approach it primarily as a scientific text, that we're going to miss what the Bible is trying to tell us about the nature of God and the way that this whole story begins. Because if we're looking at primarily, again, as a scientific text, then there's no reason to pay attention to the way in which humanity is given responsibility as co-stewards of the earth along with God. And why over and over again, and even making sense of the Noah story, that if we're looking at it primarily in scientific terms, then we're going to miss the theological message that it has to tell us about God's relationship both with violence, with humanity, about the significance of God's working with Abraham, with Moses, with the people of Israel, and even more so with the significance of Jesus, and how Jesus brings Israel's story, which again is a primarily theological story, to a full circle. And especially when we get to Revelation and we see a lot of these same themes come up. But again, if we're just looking for the science, it's not going to make sense. And so there is going to be some agreement, but then there's also going to be places where in the attempts to make the text make sense according to one's own assumption, that you got to kind of warp it and twist it a little bit, which we're all guilty of in some way, shape, or form. But again, our at least attempt is to try to understand the text on its own terms, without injecting our modern science into it. So Yeah. All right. Anybody else? All right. Well, let's go ahead. And if there are no more questions, what I'm going to do is let me go ahead and share this if you're on Moodle. If you're not, go ahead and either take a screenshot of this, take a picture of it, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you guys into breakout groups where you guys will talk about this in you guys' groups. Let me get this over here. And so what I want you guys to do, again, is reading through. I know you guys already done this, but again, just to read through it. And even if it's in brief, that what you're going to do is talk about Genesis 3, 1 through 7, and talk about the nature of the first sin and what was so wrong about what the humans did. And so also as a quick aside, it says 6a and 6b because you'll see that in your guys' text, so you'll see letters next to the numbers. It's a way of breaking down the text even farther or further. That when you have one set of text, it's like all six, you can kind of take the first half as A, the next half as B. So you kind of think of it like poetry when you're thinking stanzas and then sections like that. So are there any questions? Comments, concerns? Again, I'll go ahead and post this here, and I'll also send you guys the message. So I'll give you guys about 8 minutes to talk through this, and then we'll gather back, and then we'll talk about it. So what did you guys get from your groups? What was so wrong about what the first humans did, about Adam and Eve did? What got them in trouble?
They were trying to be like God.
How so? Talk to me about it.
When the serpent was speaking to them, he said that God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And so I see that as when they decided to eat the fruit, after that, they wanted to be like God in the sense that they were knowing good and evil and didn't need him for that anymore.
Yeah. Good. So there's something there to be able to unpack, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. That there's something about this creaturely desire, or there's something about that kind of godness, if you want to call it that, the being like God that wants to decipher between good and evil all on your own. And so, yeah, we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. Good job, Charles. Good. Anybody else?
We also, it's similar. I feel like there's not too much to go on, but how in like the drama of scripture it said autonomy, how it means to choose determining what is right and wrong for yourself rather than relying on God's direction.
Yeah.
And then they also, like in verse 6, it says, woman saw that the tree was good for food and it was pleasant to the eyes, and how she went based off of what looks was and what looked pleasant and pleasurable. But yeah.
Good. That the text, again, if you're reading it, if you kind of try to come into it without the presuppositions that we often come into the text with, that there's this emphasis on eyes all across the board. If you call across the Bible, that if you guys pay attention, of course, it's a little bit late for the Abraham one, but do start paying attention to, especially when you guys get to Judges. When we get to Judges, you'll take a look at, there's something that happens with human eyes. that the Bible is trying to get at over again and again and again. Because you'll have that come up here. You'll have it come up with Abraham, where Abraham sees certain things, like he sees, and we'll talk about it later, but Abraham will see a goat that is caught in a thicket, and what Abraham responds to God is that you're the God who sees, will see to it. Hagar says the same thing too, that you're the God who sees me. But later on, what you're going to find is that Moses is going to turn aside and see. He sees that a bush is burning. And again, you're going to see in Judges, it'll come up again, this kind of phrase, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And if you even think through a little bit more forward in Isaiah, where Isaiah is going to see the Lord seated on a throne. And so again, this emphasis on eyes and what people see, and then making either designations or decisions based on what is seen, that there's something going on there, which again we'll unpack in a few minutes. So good job, Denny, bringing that up. And Vanessa, you had said that same here. And so there's this thing that goes on between and not to say that our human eyesight is sinful, but that there's something that happens by what we see and the ways we make decisions that then kind of throws us on a certain path that is embedded in this first story. So good. And autonomy is a big problem, because again, when we just talked about being co-rulers or or vice regents, or however you want to describe it, you guys read in your drama of scripture that there's kind of this threefold description of all three, of being under the care and being responsible to Yahweh as the primary ruler, that he's the one who's keen and we're subservient under God, and that to be a reflection of God, again, to be in submission to God, is part of the responsibility that we have. But when we pull away into the autonomy, that there's issues that happen. And so good job, Denny, with bringing that up. Good. Other thoughts? Anything else? Other thoughts? One more. We'll do one more. Or was that pretty much the bulk of were those two pretty much the bulk of the answers?
I mean, there's the very surface level answer.
Go ahead.
Just didn't do what they were told to do and thought that they were, I don't know, special and didn't have to listen to what God said. That's very surface level, but yeah.
Yeah, and it is, and we'll go ahead and use that, and kind of we'll convert the surface, to use your language, Caleb. That part of the issue that does come up is this issue of not living into the vocation and their calling. That again, that the thought that you brought up, Caleb, that they're not in essence, they're not obedient. But underneath that surface, that what you see is in being a reflection of God, which was the calling of the priest, is to be a reflection of God in the world, that they kind of do it halfway, again, with being in the garden, tending to the garden, but especially when it comes to the role of being kings and queens, of being co-rulers in the earth with God, that this conversation with the snake and what the snake is able to do is help the humans not just become autonomous, but ultimately wedge the humans away from their vocation of, again, when we say having dominion, usually we think in terms of power and being able to do whatever you want instead of responsibility. And what I do want it for us, again, to our minds, and we do talk about humanity having dominion, taking dominion, what that means is being responsible for, tending to. You have the same kind of phrase, and this will transition us a little bit, for in Genesis 1, specifically in Genesis 2, of humans tending to the earth, and what the question that Cain answers to God is that, am I my brother's keeper? That you have the same word, that the tending that the humans were to do to or for the ground is the same tending or the keeping that Cain was supposed to do for Abel. That it's meaning, as the significance is that you are responsible for the other, that you're responsible for the land, that you're meant to take care of and be a steward of the land in as much as you are to be a steward of your brother, your sister. But they don't necessarily do this. What they do is that they become subservient, again, to the snake, not to God, and then end up becoming subservient unto their own selves, which we kind of see there with the eyes, with a little thing about eyes there. So, but then also asking the question, who is God, which Charles had brought up, and also Denny had brought up as well, that this creation to be godlike, that is in God's image, comes in tension with being made to be like God, because the thought is that, well, shouldn't the two be the same? And it's not. And what the text is trying to get to us is that there's something about autonomy that tends to lead humans astray. Again, and that's what Judges will flesh out again and again and again and again, is that just these kind of impulses of doing whatever you want does lead you towards a certain end, and that there is much wisdom in being obedient to Yahweh, even if it means staying within the limits of human creatureliness, which again, that's what Adam and Eve don't want, is to be able to stay within these limits. And again, the reason why I put the two of them together is because both Adam and Eve are there. That's not just Eve. And so again, that being said, that there's something good for us to have certain creaturely limitations, and that to be without limits is not good for us. And so especially if you start thinking in our day and age where we're living in with perpetual amounts of information at our fingertips, it's getting us into all kinds of trouble right now. All kinds of trouble.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned how, they were both there. It wasn't just Eve, because I know most people, when they look at the fall, they say, oh, it was Eve's fault. But is it safe to say, because you know how the Bible says that, men are supposed to be, the head and like the leaders of like, like a man and wife relationship kind of thing. So what is your opinion on, people saying, oh, it was Eve's fault, and then also there's the other argument, like, no, it was Adam's fault because he was there, like he allowed his wife to do it, kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I think without going too far into the weeds or going too far into the rabbit hole, that there's a couple things there to unpack. When it says head, that word head again means responsibility. It doesn't mean to dominate, to domineer, to control, to make subservient. Like that passage in Ephesians 5 about wives submit to your husbands comes right after that word submit is assumed, but it comes after the bit. It's the male's role is in line with the way of Christ gives himself over to the church, and that is in self-sacrificial giving. And so again, that you see when you take it over to Philippians 2, and I'll bounce around a little bit and I'll get to the question, because there's a lot to underscore there. That Philippians 2, where Jesus makes himself a servant to God, and that's the role and position that he takes as one of a servant. And so there's much disservice to be done when, as either the head, as being a husband, or even as a male, there's much damage to be done when you assume that to be in charge means to dominate and not to bear responsibility for, and especially when it means the nourishment and the nurture of the other. Again, in male-female relationships, romantic relationships, I think I've brought this up before, but I'll bring it up to you guys now. Having lived in a house, abusive house, and seen what, especially being Hispanic, is seeing how destructive machismo can get, that it's difficult, especially as a Christian, to both dominate but then try to be a servant at the same time. It just doesn't work. And so there's that bit. The other one is that to place the blame on Eve, there's a context for it, and I understand that people oftentimes pull on Paul, because in Romans that he'll say that it was Eve. But again, that's to read Paul backwards into Genesis, not to read Genesis for what it's trying to say. And that the failure ultimately goes back to Adam, because it was his responsibility, because he was the one that heard from God about what it is that they were ought to do. So it's still Adam's fault for either not transmitting that information to Eve and teaching his wife and telling her what exactly it is that Yahweh had told them, but then also not intervening between the two. that when Adam sees and knows something that's going on, because there's, I'll go ahead and go over to it real quick again. I don't want to get too far into this, even though I kind of know I already am, but if you go over to Genesis 3, which I will do with you guys right now. And I'll do it. I'll go from NRSV, and let me go ahead and pull this out for you guys really quick. Okay, so Genesis 3. So anytime you see this word you, that this is what makes knowing biblical languages all the more important. That he said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from the tree in the garden? So that word you here in Hebrew is plural. It's best rendered for anybody from Texas, or best rendered y'all, you all, you too, because again, it's on the plural. The woman said to the serpent, we may eat from the fruit of the trees of the garden, but did God say y'all must not eat from the tree that's in the garden, much of you will die. Y'all will not certainly die, for God knows when y'all eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. So again, and she also gave some to her husband. It doesn't say that Adam walked in just from behind a tree and decided to appear because he was negligent to everything that happened and decided, hey, there's this random fruit, let me go ahead and take a bite. And so Adam's there while it's all going down. So he's not absent from what's happening there. What's happening later on in Paul again is he's trying to make a theological argument based on his exegesis of the text that is trying to position humanity in such a state that's needing redemption more so than trying to cast the blame on Eve as the sole proprietor of the one who's now thrust humanity into the toilet, and now we're all messed up because of her. But know that Adam does bear the weight of responsibility as well for that. So again, long answer to a short question, but again, there's just a lot to unpack there because of so much, and there's a lot that we assume and take, not only bring into the text, but then pull out of the text and saying that it's all Eve's fault without knowing some of the finer little points that are there. Because again, if we just gloss over a lot of this, then we're going to miss it. And then end up blaming women and saying, well, women's the weaker vessel. Women are the weaker vessel. They're too emotional to lead. They're the weaker vessel. You know what happened with Eve, and that's a bunch of BS. That's a bunch of BS. So,
Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
you're welcome. You're welcome. It's worth showing up to class for, hopefully, just that bit. And still we have more coming. Like Smash Mouth. It doesn't stop coming, and it doesn't stop coming. All right. Any other questions, comments? All right, so let me go ahead and we'll go back to the PowerPoint here. There we go. So that being said, again, to go into to be made like God and making the call on what is good and evil, that there's something to human limitations that is good for us. And so before we again transition out of this, that usually the Old Testament especially, and I have to be an apologist, a defender for the Old Testament oftentimes, that humans are, that the God in the Old Testament is vengeful, he's angry, he's got an axe to grind against humans because of all the crap that they're doing. So that for all the things, and again, that goes from a very, very certain kind of reading into the Old Testament, but there's always these signs of mercy, of redemption that God is working out. One of them, that in the face of the shame that these humans are experiencing, because they do experience shame in light of their newfound information or ability to know good and evil, that they don't die. Mind you, that the talk was supposed to be that if Adam ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that he was going to die. he was going to die. And in Genesis 2, let me go ahead and pull that up for you guys really quick. That there's a thought that, or there's a statement that if Adam eats from the tree, then surely he's going to die. And oftentimes the way this is preached is that you'll take die because the way that Hebrew is laid out, and it's taken usually to mean two kinds of death, physical or spiritual, when that isn't the case. What the Hebrew is trying to communicate is that if you eat from this tree, there's 100%, without a shadow of a doubt, there's going to be no way out of it, that you absolutely will die. You're done. But yet, they don't. The humans don't die. Why? Because God shows mercy. It's not that God's lying. It's not that the devil's right, but that God chooses to show mercy towards the humans and not and their living. That God makes garments for them because, again, they're expelled from the garden. That they attempt to cover themselves with fig leaves. And what does God do? That there's an animal that has to be killed, and out of the skins, that there's a covering that's made. And that, again, if we're reading this purely with our assumptions in mind, we're going to miss this, but that our sin costs something. Our negligence, the evil that we commit against God and one another costs something. And that something has to die in order to atone for it. And so he expels them from the garden so they don't live eternally without relationship, mercy. And mind you, I'll bring this up now and I'll repeat it. That note that the humans don't just get kicked out of the garden. Yeah, they're kicked out, but God goes with them and they go east. That God goes with the humans and they go east. God goes with the humans even after disobedience, even after rebellion in the garden, that God goes with the humans and they go east. And that's going to be an important theme to notice, because especially that this movement east is usually one meaning exile. That God goes with the humans. And so Eve, being the mother of all creation, is meant that childbirth is meant to be a blessing, and now childbirth will become life-threatening. As is the case both in America and around the world, that especially that for women, the childbirth is childbirth and delivery is a dangerous thing. And again, for all our technology, it still is a risky thing. And that you have subservience, that sexism and patriarchy is introduced, that humanity and the initial vision in which God had created are meant to be co-rulers with one another. They're not meant to just be hierarchical. That patriarchy and sexism isn't the norm. It's only after Genesis 3 that you have patriarchy take precedence. It's only after Genesis 3 that you have patriarchy become normative. And so Adam, that by the sweat of his brow is he going to be working the ground. And mind you, it's not that work is a result of the fall, or what we call the fall, or the fallout. That work isn't a result of sin, because Adam and Eve were to work, or Adam was to work the ground before Genesis 3, and we see that in Genesis 2. But that what's going to become an issue for him is the manner in which he goes about his work, which is the kind of anxiety that comes with the work. That there's an anxiety that by the sweat of his own face is he going to work, wondering if his work is going to be enough, the kind of anxiety that comes about, which a lot of us are familiar with, so we could thank Adam for that. And again, myself, being a 33-year-old Hispanic, of wondering whether or not my work will produce, whether or not my work is enough, whether or not I'm enough, whether or not there will be enough to cover everything, all the expenses, everything to eat, the gas, the insurance, bills that are piling up, about wondering about whether or not my work will be enough, whether or not I'm enough for the work that I'm doing, whether or not I'm enough for just anything that I'm involved with the kind of anxiety that often couples itself with the work that we're doing. And so again, it is part of the human experience to experience that anxiety. Yet at the same time, to be reminded for ourselves and to remind one another that it's God who provides, not us. That it's God who takes care of us, and that we entrust ourselves to God to be able to provide in light of the gaps that we're feeling. And we need that we need that, especially for us who are perfectionists, that are workaholics, that even for us that aren't any of those, but we just love the work, but we often wonder about our own abilities, that we need the word of comfort that lets us know that it's God who takes care of us and not just us of ourselves. Though we do have responsibilities to work and all that. It's God who's the one who's the ultimate provider for all that. And so this kind of uncreation starts unraveling itself, and we see that as we get closer to Genesis 6, that their image of God remains and they're called to be representatives. They retain their vocation as God's stewards, but wrong choices are going to create tensions in human relationships. And again, we see this most specifically in Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel. That be fruitful and multiply is going to end in the death of another, and that instead of representing God's image, there's going to be a temptation to kill it in others, which Cain will assume, and that Cain will participate in. And so also going to be important for us to notice is that violence is going to be the only sin mentioned before the flood. Violence is the only sin mentioned before the flood in Genesis 6. We'd probably expect it to be greed, lust, some kind of pride, but no, it's violence. It's violence. The only sin mentioned, that as the world begins to populate, that it's violence is what the world starts growing full of. So who comes on the scene? Noah, our boy Noah. So what I'm going to have you guys to do, we'll take a break after this. You know what we'll do? We'll go ahead and take a break now. I'll give you guys 15 minutes to take a break, and then we'll go from Noah. We'll figure out a way to go from Noah to Moses in about an hour. So go ahead, take 15 minutes now. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, yeah, now's the time to ask, but if not, you guys are free to take a break.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So I was looking at the homework that was due today.
Yeah.
I wrote it down. So for Exodus, when you say to read 1 through 5, are those this might sound dumb, but are those the big numbers or like the
Chapters.
Okay.
Yeah, so the big ones.
Okay. Just making sure.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Yeah, those are chapters. With humanity in order to bring about both redemption and bringing about how that cooperation ends up working itself out. But again, it's set against its backdrop, where you have this guy who he's obedient. That doesn't really necessarily make sense in his context to build a giant boat because it's supposed to be a flood that's coming. And so, good job, Caleb. All right, anybody else? And also consider the context. Go back to creation, go back to Adam and Eve, go back to Cain and Abel. Go ahead.
One thing that I noticed just reading this was this is the first time that God made a covenant with mankind and saying that he would destroy the earth in a flood again.
Yeah. Yeah, good. And I'll bring this up later on, but that covenant is going to be the primary way that God relates himself and establishes relationship with humanity. That covenant will be the way that God establishes relationship between himself and humanity. That if there, again, you could think, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes, there's going to be a short list of covenants, but the ways in which God works with humanity, again, is going to be on what we'll call, what I tend to call is cooperative partnership. cooperative partnership, which is demonstrated in covenant. And you guys will know from your BLE class that covenant is in existence before Abraham comes on the scene, that it's one of the ways in which God condescends to human cultures, human rituals, to be able to communicate to humanity and communicate to us in ways that we understand. And so that's what God does. He cuts covenants. He creates in human life with people. And so it's not until Jesus, we don't have to wait till Jesus comes on the scene before we see God interacting with humanity. He does it here with covenant. Good. And so to put it into context, and I guess we'll do an exercise on this where we're seeing the ways in which to connect the two stories in the way in which God, what significance is there for Noah's story in light of the story that's been preceding him, is that you see this kind of return of the chaos, that you see Tehom make its return in the form of waters that are being used by God, except for this time that he's using them to hit the reset button on humanity. That humanity that's failed to live into created order, that again, with violence spreading on the earth, that you kind of see this progression from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel, and now to all of humankind, that you see this kind of spread of rebellion all over the world. That you see kind of autonomy all over the world and how it's wreaking havoc, and the way it's demonstrated itself isn't just in this ambiguous, all-consuming blob called sin or all-consuming blob called evil, but demonstrated in violence. And so what happens is that there's a kind of chaos that the world is being plunged back into, and the way I put it is kind of the world has created order is becoming undone. Whereas God is establishing order, the way in which sin and violence, all these things, undo creation and undo created order and plunges it back into chaos. That God is going to do something about it, and the way he responds is through the flood. That God is going to reestablish order. That God is going to cut a covenant or make a covenant with all creation. That God is going to begin again with Noah and his family, that you have the same phrase that be fruitful and increase, or be fruitful and multiply, being said. The first issue happening to humanity in Genesis 1:28 is going to come back, or Genesis 1:28 through 30, it's going to come back again in Genesis 9 to Noah, to be fruitful and multiply. And so now the struggle for God is going to be redeem humans and not just fighting against them. The struggle is going to be to redeem humans and not just fight against them. And what God will utilize again and again and again is human participation and cooperation. What God will use again and again is human participation and cooperation, which will take us right over to Father Abraham. And let me go ahead and share that with you guys. Again, this is up on, this is going to be session 2 on your Moodle page. You guys are taking a look at that. This will be session 2 on your Moodle page. And I took out the first couple of slides just because, again, they're repetitive and they're talking about the acts. But what you'll see here is with Noahic covenant, which we just talked about, and how the covenants will start to build on one another, the way in which God will develop his relationship, not just with humanity in general, but through chosen people that will come on down the line, which we'll see with Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and then with Jesus. That it's through these covenants that God's purposes for the world will be both revealed and also will come to fruition. That as we just talked about with Noahic covenant, and I'll have this on a different side, but that way you guys can see this, is that Noahic covenant is essentially God vowing to never destroy the earth again and humanity with water again. That God's not going to use creation against itself in order to hit restart. that you see a kind of creation, that you see a kind of covenant with creation, but you see in definitive terms how God will create covenant with Noah, and then he's going to create a covenant with Abraham. So again, so I'll go back to this one, but we'll be slowly moving through the covenants, and I'll mention them when they do come around, and we'll be moving through these three, specifically Mosaic, Abrahamic, and Noahic covenant today. And this is up on the slides for you guys to see. That again, this is up on Moodle. This will give you a good timeline. This is taken from Richter's Epic of Eden. And so we're going to be moving from Noah, which is a kind of an unknown period, all the way through to around over here. So we're going to be covering about 600 years, 600, 800 years. And so again, this is on Moodle. You guys are looking for this. This will also be helpful for you guys' storyboard projects at the end of the semester, so you guys have an idea of where people are fitting into and what's going on for the various periods, especially at the divided monarchy. All right. Any questions about that? Comments so far? Questions, comments so far? All right. Well, let's go ahead and keep it moving then. So, again, I mentioned covenant here. When we move from Noah to Abraham, we're not making this seismic shift between things kind of perpetually bad, and then eventually God kind of picks a person and moves on. What we're going to start seeing is that God's choice of individuals to work with them, and in working with either individuals or groups, that they become the kind of means or mediators between themselves and the rest of humanity. Now, when we talked about Scripture's story in you guys' assignment, you guys are looking at Abraham and his specific particular set of circumstances that he's presented with. What happens with Abraham is that God's picking of an individual and to work out his plan comes up again in the story. I'll go ahead and read this for you all. That scene one of People for the King, that the moment we usurp, we deconstruct the world God has created, so God chooses, and here I will leave the mystery to God, Abraham, in order to form a nation of kings and priests. This comes up again. To form a nation of kings and priests. That is, the assignment God gave to Adam was transferred to Abraham and then to Israel. Again, we have one through line from Adam through Abraham that will go on to Israel. But if we aren't able to identify both in terms of words and ideas and then covenant of how this kind of calling is being transferred from Adam and Eve over to Abraham and then to Israel, and how Jesus fulfills this and then gives us the responsibility to be kings and queens and priests and priestesses in the world, that we're going to miss it. And to see the development of how God is working out his plan and has worked out his plan and where we fall into that. But what we first see is a man who comes on the scene, a son of Terah or Terah, named Abraham. And so I'm going to go ahead and read that so you guys get an idea of what we're looking at. Let me go ahead and jump over here. Let me pull it. So, let me go ahead and share this with you all. So Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Again, there's this kind of emphasis on the eyes, the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and to the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so there's going to be an issue between the two, because as we find out later in the story, that the issue for Abram is going to be that he not only is old, but his wife is also barren. But before we find out this kind of thing that's supposed to happen to Abram in becoming a great nation, that you see Abram, at this point, I just keep calling him Abraham, that Abram is called to leave his land, to leave an inheritance, and essentially what God is inviting him, asking him to do, is to leave behind his inheritance, his security. Because again, especially for a nomadic people, it was important not only first it was important to belong to a house, and specifically the way that it happened was through patriarchy, and that a lot of the means of living and providing for a family was going to be through the father or through the father's lineage. And so for Abram to leave that would mean to leave all guarantees of security in order to go and follow after this deity that just so happens to appear. And mind you, Abram is in a polytheistic context. So again, the assumption is that there are multiple deities out there, and God presents himself, or Yahweh presents himself, as one who just is out there amongst the rest. And so when we kind of take a step back to ask the question, well, how does Abram know about all these kinds of things, and would Abram have known? And the answer is yes, because again, we see Abram participating in a few chapters later in sacrifice on an altar. But again, it's because of Abram already being entrenched in a culture in which this is the normative, that religious practices are normal and normative and to be expected in this time. And so what does God do? He cuts a covenant. He does what he does. He cuts a covenant with Abram in order to provide the means and the security that Abram needs in order to continue to move forward. Because mind you, Abram's got questions, and it's not wrong of us to ask questions, especially when it comes to being asked of something that God is willing to provide. And so I'm going to go ahead and go through that with y'all, because again, it is going to be important for us to read through in the narrative. I'm going to go ahead and pull this up for you guys. I'm going to go back and forth a little bit, but just hang with me, and then we'll get to the importance here. God's covenant with Abram. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Abram's got questions. He doesn't have any kids, and he recognizes he's old and his wife is barren. And so again, Abram has pushback on how God is going to get this done. That there isn't necessarily just this overall, you better believe God or else it's not going to happen. That doubt is going to throw God's plan out the window. That's not the case for Abram. And so in verse 3, that Abram said, you have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him that this man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue, your very own child, a child born from your own loins will be your heir. He brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. And then he said to them, so shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, he trusted the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him, or credited it to him as righteousness. Then he said to him, I am the Lord, I am Yahweh, who brought you from Ur, the land of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to possess. And this is just an aside, but a very important one, that Ur, the land of Chaldeans, That's Babylon. That's where the Babylonians are from. It's Chaldea, ancient Chaldea, but still nonetheless. And so God is working with this outsider in order to bring about redemption for his people. Verse 8, but he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, bring me a young calf or a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. A bunch of birds, about to have a barbecue. And he brought all these three, cut them in two, laying each half over against each other, but he did not cut the birds in two. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, he drove them away. And as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there. And they shall be oppressed for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. But as for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age, and shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, to your descendants, to your descendants, I give this land. From the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, land of Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and the Jebusites. God cuts a covenant with Abram to let him know that he is for real, and he being God. And the big deal about God cutting a covenant is that what God is communicating to Abram in no small terms is telling him, whatever happens to these pieces, let it happen to me if I don't make it happen for you. But again, this is in the context of Abram's doubts and concerns about whether or not God is going to be able to make this happen. Why? Because the natural condition of Abram's body isn't able to produce. And so God is going to have to make it happen. And so then God will intervene in order to make it, again, not just to make it happen, but to ultimately produce a child for Abram that will lead to a great nation coming around. And so the covenant is going to be initiated. It's initiated by God, moved forward, not just by God, but through human participation in what God is doing. Which ultimately brings us Genesis 17. Here's me to go back there. And again, let me know to slow down if you need me to. That the Abrahamic covenant, you can summarize it in three ways, which is why I put it in this way. Of people, place, and presence. Where God's promising a great people, descendants, a bunch of babies. God's promising a land, a place for the people to dwell. And again, if you're a nomadic people wandering from land to land, having a place to call your own, it's a big deal. A big, 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 big deal. And then the promise of presence, that God is going to be with them, that God will be God to Abraham's descendants, and they're going to be his people, which is spelled out more in Genesis 17. And so I won't go too much into detail here, but it's here where God is going to make the name change from Abram to Abraham. And it's here where we get the introduction of circumcision. And again, for those of you that are in BLE, you guys will be working on a passage. I believe you guys are still working on a passage out of Galatians. Perhaps a different one, but still out of Galatians. Well, you guys will be talking about what's happening in Galatia with Judaizers and whatnot, but it's because of what's happening here in circumcision. Let me see. Why did he change his name? So the significance of names in ancient Near Eastern cultures is that a name often dictated a destiny. And especially for deities, the way that you recognize what a deity's authority was, what their function was often by their name. And so you could think of, we usually have some experience with it with Greco-Roman mythology, that, you have like Mars, who's the god of war, that embedded within their names is a kind of title or role. And so what God is doing here is not just changing his name, but also changing the description. That Abram, meaning exalted father, was going to now be changed to father of many nations. And so I go into more detail with it in Pentateuch, but in Hebrew, that God literally extends Abram's name, that he enlarges his name. So it'd be like, instead of calling you Bob, you're now changing to Bobby. Like you're literally adding letters to make the name longer. And so that's what God is doing for Abram and changing his name. But again, he's also changing his destiny of what his calling is going to be. So, does that answer your question? Is that clear? Okay, good. All right. Now let me go ahead here. And so circumcision, I have brought this up before, but circumcision, it's both symbolic, but then also, again, what it's meant to represent is the unchanging covenant between God and humans that he's in covenant with, which again, it makes it both an identity marker, but also a reminder that these who are marked by God are chosen by God, and that God is in covenant with them, but it also requires a responsibility, that it takes, that God's faithfulness and human responsibility aren't mutually exclusive, but are to be expected. That God is going to continue to be faithful, but then also the expectation of our responsibility in response to his faithfulness. And we'll talk about that more when we get to Paul's letters, but that it's because of God's faithfulness that the expectation is to respond. And again, this is in the Old Testament, where because God has done something, it now requires a human response. That circumcision wasn't seen as legalism. It's a part of who they were. It designates them and lets them know that they're a people of the covenant, that it lets them know that they're God's chosen people in response to the ways God showed himself faithful. But it does become legalism when it becomes determinative of whether or not you belong to God's people. If you do this one thing, then you are now God's people. It's not in response to God having made you his people. And so again, it's in those kind of those finer points to be able to detail between in what ways is this just purely legalism, or is it meant to actually be a grace? And so I'm gonna, because you already did this for your read and reflect, I'm going to go briefly over this with Hagar and Ishmael. That what we have with Hagar and Ishmael's story, that you have Hagar as the first theologian of the Bible. And what I mean by that is that Hagar has this experience with God. And in that, she's reflecting on the way God's providing. And it has words for what God is doing in response to that, and understands something about the way God is in the world, that God is a God who sees us. That God is one who sees the plight of those who suffer. God is the one who provides for those who are without. And it's because of the way God is with those in the world that prompts us to ask ourselves the question, as being ones who reflect God in the world, as followers of Jesus, who have a calling, again, to be kings and priests, queens and priestesses. How do we go about reflecting God in the world and participating in life with those who suffer? Do we reflect more of the grace and the compassion of God, or do we engage in practices like Sarai that just make the conditions of those who suffer worse? Because mind you, at this point, Hagar is a single mom out in the middle of the desert with nothing to live off of. It's already tough enough being mom, let alone to be a homeless mom out in the desert. But God notices, and God cares. And so how do we as Christians, as followers of Jesus, engage in practices and engage in actions on behalf of those, again, who suffer? Again, it's a question to think about, reflect on. But again, for the sake of time, that we, should time have allowed us more time to talk about it, you can talk about it. But you know, we'll take time to slow down in the coming weeks to talk about these kinds of things, because it's important issues for us to think about. Important issues for us to think about. And so Abraham and Isaac, and I do need to take a pause here because of the story, and I'm only going to mention it in brief. Again, we go through it more in Pentateuch. But there's something significant that happens in Genesis 22. And not just in terms of Abraham. If we just jump straight to Jesus, we're going to miss what's happening here. In that Abraham, as the model of faith, in seeing that God will provide a sacrifice, challenges us. Because Abraham is essentially giving up the one thing he was promised. And the challenge for us, even in just reading the story for what it is that do we, as people who follow Jesus, are we in this thing primarily for what we get as beneficiaries, or do we follow Jesus no matter what it costs us personally, even the very things that God has promised to us? That do we follow God for who he is, or do we follow because of the benefits we are provided? And again, the challenge for us as followers of Jesus is to just take the benefits and run. To see the blessings on blessings on blessings and just to run with that. And when life gets hard, you know what? This sucks. I'm out. And it's not to say that we're not allowed the space to be able to complain, to be able to come up with the different things that we struggle with. But is our primary aim as followers of Jesus to receive the benefits of what he offers, or is it really out of a pure loyalty that we have, that no matter what the cost is going to be, that we're willing to follow Jesus, even when it means a sacrifice from us? And so again, to be able to hear the story on its own terms, and for us to hear in our own contemporary context that oftentimes what is going to be more difficult is the following in the midst of, again, especially in circumstances like right now, where we're all uncomfortable right now. All of us are uncomfortable right now. But that the challenge for us is to be able to continue to follow Jesus when it doesn't make sense. When 1 + 1 isn't adding up to 2. 1 + 1 is giving us somewhere between 2 and 3. We're still trying to figure out what that means. And so again, for us, that the challenge to live in the place in between the tension of the now and not yet, of knowing that God is good and God is with us, but yet things are unfolding just painfully and excruciatingly slow, to the point where faith and trust is no longer just a thing that is for just the Christians who they're exemplary Christians and they got big prayers and all the things, but it's demanded of all of us. Demanded of all of us, that as followers of Jesus, that the ways in which we're going to not just be able to survive this time, but for the rest of our lives, is going to be, it's going to be tried time and time and again and again and again and again. And before the pandemic, It's kind of one of those things where only when life got hard that we really needed to have faith. And when I say have faith, and what I mean by that is to trust, to be loyal. But to really be able to trust God, that we're going to, not only are we going to be all right, but that God ultimately, that God's with us. He intends good for us, and that, again, more than anything else, that he's working out things towards his ends, that he's still in control, he's still king. And so again, that being said, that the story of Abraham and Isaac, what it poses to us, especially as a challenge, and especially in the narrative, is that Abraham is the model of faith. That in light of faithlessness of what we see in Genesis 3, what we see in Genesis 6, of how Abraham serves as this model of what does it mean to be a follower for no other reason than just pure loyalty. Pure loyalty. Are there any comments, questions? Because again, we're going to be going through Exodus pretty quick, so I don't want to move on from that too quick. You know, we do spend more time with this in Pentateuch, so. Questions? Okay, so I'm going to go through this very briefly. So the rest of Genesis, and I hate saying this, but it's going to follow a cycle between faithfulness and disobedience. And especially in the Jacob stories, again, we cover this more in Pentateuch. Jacob stories, you can see this in Isaac's story, but especially in Joseph. Joseph is the way that the people transition from going from where they're at and to going into Egypt, because Egypt is going to be an essential place that the people are going to have to go into. And so what you're going to see are these patterns of deception, patterns of violence. You're also going to see, sadly, you're going to see incest, you're going to see rape, but you're ultimately going to see the breakdown of family relationships. And this is going to be exemplified no more than in the Joseph story at the end of Genesis. But yet we see the continual grace of God in providing for his people, even despite the errors of human activity. That we see God's grace even in the face, despite human activity. Which is going to take us over into Exodus. And so at the end of Exodus, the people of Israel are going to migrate into Egypt to try to navigate a famine that's recently hit their land. And you're going to see God's promise to Abraham partially fulfilled, and Israel multiplies. So I'm going to go ahead and share this with you all. And as you'll see here, that these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. So it's going to be Israel and these are names of Israel and his kids. Verse 6, then Joseph died and all his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific, or let me put it in this way, the Israelites were fruitful and they multiplied. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. What does that sound like? And you can either shout it out or throw it in the chat. What does that sound like? What other place where have you read that?
With Noah.
With Noah, yep. Yep, and before him?
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve, great. And God's promise, good job, Lauren. God's promise to Abraham, that you're going to see the fulfillment of what's happening and promise to Abraham starts to get its partial fulfillment, if not partial fulfillment, over in Exodus. But then there's also these words that, again, if we read through it too quickly, we can miss it, of what's happening here and the ways God is working out his plan, even in the midst of adverse circumstances happening to his people. And so Israel is going to multiply in Egypt. But there's a problem because it seems as though God is not with the people because of what's happening in terms of oppression and the way Pharaoh is treating the people. That you have this phrase that Pharaoh does not know Joseph and that he dealt shrewdly with the Hebrews to the point where he will enslave the people. That you have this phrase in Exodus 1 where Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph. And what that phrase means is broken relationship. Broken relationship. That Joseph, who is second in command in Egypt, the relationship between Pharaoh and the Hebrews is going to be one of a broken one, which leads to, again, dealing shrewdly, getting mistreated to the point where children are now going to suffer. And so we read in Exodus 1:15 through 22, which you guys were to have read again, that with the Hebrew midwives, that are going to preserve the children of the Hebrews. And I'll go ahead and pull this up for you all. And so the Egyptians became ruthless. This is verse 13. I'm going to go down. Imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service and brick and mortar and every kind of field labor. Verse 15, that the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, that's when you see them giving birth. If it's a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. Again, that phrase, the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but every girl you shall let live. And so to quote Richter here, that every time I read the story, I try to get my mind around what it would be like to be a midwife who assists a mother all the way through birth, only to suffocate the newborn in her arms, while the new mother lies there begging for her child's life. So it's in this context, again, not only do you have the suffering of God's people, but then also the death of children. Do you have these two resistors who are women, again, and as I brought up a couple weeks ago, and I'll bring up today, that women will provide a lot of the ways the stories move forward, both in terms of the way that they're contrasted with their context, and also how they will often be the exemplars in the story. And it's here that you see these exemplary women serving as civil disobedient examples of preserving life in the face of evil. And so again, with these two women that have God's blessing on these two women, that while women often take advantage, what we see is that the narrative cannot continue to move forward without these women. That especially in ancient cultures where women were seen both as subservient and second class, the biblical story does not shy away from making them often the heroines of the story, of making them the exemplars in the story. God often utilizes women first and then later men. And often this is exactly what happens in Moses' story. That Israel is going to be formed by a mighty act of God, which we know now as the Exodus event. And so the scene is going to be set at the end of chapter 2. I'm going to introduce us to a new character, God. And again, in the Exodus story, for the first 2 chapters, for the first chapter and a half, we hear nothing about God until the end of chapter 2, when things get so bad that the Hebrews cry out. And again, it's going to be a threefold expression at the end of Exodus chapter 2, where we hear that the Hebrews are crying out in the midst of their labor. And so Israel's going to cry out to Yahweh. And he's going to remember his covenant. I'm going to go ahead and pull this up for you guys to see so you guys can see what I'm talking about here. So starting at verse 23. That after a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of their slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice with them. And that'll take us over to Moses and the burning bush. And so again, we have this language that if we're too quick to read through it, that we're going to miss it, about how both what's happening in terms of the story and how things are progressively getting worse and worse for the Hebrews, but it's in this worse and worse context that God decides to show up. And so Moses, who's like Yahweh, is sick of seeing the oppression, and he goes and he kills an Egyptian government authority, which should be that. And so it's in the midst of Moses being on the run that God gives his name to Moses, shares his name with Moses. And this phrase comes up, I am, or I am who I am, I will be who I will be, or I will be what I am. And part of what this is meant to communicate is that Yahweh isn't going to be arbitrary or capricious like the other gods that Moses is used to. Again, that Moses is in a culture where the humans are meant to serve the purposes and the will of the deities. And it's often capricious. It's often willy-nilly, kind of just, you don't know what's going to happen. Whimsical. But the project of liberation that God's done will continue on in and through Moses, and that God is making good on his promise to Abraham, which is why that threefold phrase, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or even when God says that or when the text says that God remembered Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's God recalling his covenant to those three individuals. And so God is coming to make good on that promise. Which we get introduced to Pharaoh. And again, the reason why I bring up these two characters specifically is because, and you guys know this, see this in you guys' assignment, is that who are the main characters in the Exodus story?
God and Pharaoh.
God and Pharaoh, good. There's one more.
Moses. Oh.
Moses, good. Good. Moses in the mix too. And it's important to identify these three for the fact that, well, one, God is always the main character, but it's going to be very difficult to make sense of the plagues if we don't take notice of what's happening between God and Pharaoh, and specifically with Moses and the people kind of in the middle. That we can't, again, if you're thinking Prince of Egypt, great, but also to be able to think and consider that who is the conflict, the tension, who's the contest between. You can talk about it?
God and Pharaoh.
God and Pharaoh, perfect, good. And then Moses acts as a representative for God, as a kind of mediator on both behalf of God and behalf of the people. But again, it's in this context that God intervenes in the midst of oppression, that God sends an individual to act both as a representative and as a mediator between the people in order to alleviate and bring redemption for God's people. And so this is why I bring up again the points that we bring up with narrative reading, doing our scripture story assignments, and why we're reading as narrative criticism, because again, we can miss these points if we're not seeing the tensions and we're seeing the points of conflict between the two. And so to bring up Pharaoh's character, again, that if we don't bring that up, it's gonna miss what's going on between the two, and especially how the story gets resolved. That what happens with the both in terms of the Exodus event and then for the Passover event is the demonstration of God's triumph over Pharaoh, over Egypt, and even over the gods of the Egyptians. But again, if we don't identify who the contest is between, then we're going to miss what's going on between the text and the way it's being interpreted, and trying to tell us, again, a story about who God is. The God's triumph over the Egyptian deities. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Would you consider, so for characters, I put would you consider the Israelites and Egyptians characters as well?
Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. I maybe wouldn't, I would probably put Egyptians, I would couple Pharaoh and the Egyptians because they're the ones oppressing the Hebrews. And so I wouldn't necessarily have the Hebrews as the main characters, but I would definitely include them alongside what's happening between Moses and the people, Moses and the Hebrews.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So it's not wrong to have included other parties, but to definitely decipher between who are the main ones, but then who's also included in the stories, especially if they can be grouped together. Because again, Pharaoh and the Egyptians can be grouped in the same thing. But there's definitely something going on between Pharaoh and Yahweh, which again, going over to Exodus 5:1-2, that the phrase, who's Yahweh that I shall obey him and let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh and I will not let Israel go. That it's not a curiosity that Pharaoh has about who is this God? Let me meet him. Let's sit down and have some tea, and then we'll get to know each other. It's more of a challenge about who's this fool. And anybody who's played sports or has been any kind of challenge, you know that anytime somebody shows up new on the field, on the pitch, on the court, that anytime somebody new comes and wants to challenge you, the challenge is, who's this fool? And again, it's less curiosity and more of a challenge. And so there's this claim of lordship over Israel, over God's people, about who is Israel meant to serve? Is it going to be Pharaoh or is it going to be Yahweh? And again, if we can put it this way, it's going to be a contest for their faith or for their allegiance. But again, what the plagues do is that the plagues make it evident who is actually king and who's not. And what the plagues will make evident is who is king and who is not. And so Passover will serve as a reminder about God's act of liberation. And it's meant to be a celebration of the liberation of God's people, that again, and I'll say this now and I'll make sure to bring it up later on, that there's a kind of freedom that comes with servitude to Yahweh that pulls us out of servitude to Pharaoh. That there's a freedom that comes in being a servant of Yahweh that isn't experienced in being a servant to Egypt. That true freedom is found in being a servant of Yahweh, not in being a servant of Pharaoh, the servant of the oppressors, the servant of those who decide to have power and to manipulate, to subjugate, to oppress. But there's liberation in being a servant of Yahweh. And so the Israelites are going to order their entire calendar around Yahweh's act of redemption, of liberation. And again, to save for time, that there's so much of Hebrew identity that is going to be formed around this event of the Exodus. And it'll come up again and again and again, especially as you guys are reading through Deuteronomy and then again through Judges, and you'll see it again in the prophets, that there's going to be a call back for the people to be reminded of how they were delivered from the hands of the Egyptians. of how God delivered them with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And what that means is to detail them about how God had demonstrated strength in order to redeem the people, to bring them back to himself. And so again, that this will be an event that forms the Hebrew imagination, not just for this generation, but for generations to come, in order to remember the God who has redeemed them. And so Pharaoh will give chase after the Exodus event, after the final plague of the death of the firstborn. And I'll go through this quickly, but in order to get us to Mosaic covenant, because it's going to be important for us to identify that it's after the Exodus event that the Israelites are brought towards a mountain, which is Mount Sinai, and that God will bind himself at this point, not just to an individual, which we talked about with Noah and with Abraham, how God's chosen an individual, but that now God will bind himself to an entire people. God will bind himself to an entire people. And the way that it's being expressed is as a relationship, that Yahweh had brought the people to himself as a treasured possession. That God desires to be in intimate relationship with his people, that he chooses them not just as a privilege, but as service. Again, where we see the language where Israel's calling is to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And what does that mean? It doesn't just mean set apart. Because usually when we hear holy, it means that you're separate from, you're separated, you're set apart, you're in the world but not of the world. But specifically in the Old Testament, and the more accurate designation for holy is more different, distinct, and unique in the midst of, not separate from. Because mind you, God retains his holiness in the midst of the people, but yet he's still different. He's unique. And likewise, Israel is meant to be different, unique in the context, in the midst of surrounding nations, in the way that they set up their customs, their laws, their economics, the politics, everything that they have set up is meant to be different, distinct from their neighbors. That it's a system that is meant to show who God is. And it's through this demonstration of who God is that other nations are meant to catch a glimpse of who God is, that there is a God in Israel. Why? Because of the way the Hebrews treat one another. And we can't miss this point because of the fact that not only do we tend to read the Old Testament, specifically the Pentateuch, and read through the different laws, specifically as legalism, a bunch of rules that were meant to bind the people, but what it's meant to do is to help the people, again, to live into their vocation as kings and priests, to both be responsible and care for the earth and one another as kings, but then as priests to be responsible and to also be reflection of God in the world. And in doing those two things, the nations, the surrounding nations that don't know Yahweh, aren't in covenant with Yahweh, were meant to be brought into relationship with him. That it's not being set up arbitrarily or just to have rules for rules' sake. That it's Yahweh teaching and showing the people both how to be responsible and care for one another, and also to be reflections of himself in the world. But as we will see, Israel has a real hard time with this. A real hard time with this. And so again, as we're reading through Exodus and reading through different laws and Numbers and Deuteronomy, to keep this in mind, that as we're reading through it, and as you're reading through Judges, to keep this in mind as well, of the calling that the people have to both be responsible for one another and to take care of the earth, but also to be reflections of God in the earth, in the way that they are to care for one another, in their worship, and their ethics and everything, that they were supposed to be representatives of God in the world. But again, to miss this point is going to be to miss so much of what is going on with Judges, and to miss out on the fact that what is happening in those passages are completely antithetical to what we're trying to get at here. And so are there any questions, comments, concerns? Questions?
I just think that it's really interesting that we're going through this right now. You know, that sort of part of we're supposed to be a kingdom of priests and represent who God is to the rest of the nations, or at least Israel was. You know, and at the same time, in spiritual gifts, we're learning the same thing, and that had been something that had really like when Amy Selby like talked about it, you know. That had like been taken and it shaped the bedrock of my faith, right? Because in my home church, right, they sort of idolize like pastors, like, you know, like pastors have the responsibility to go out and be priests and do that and evangelize and show God to the world, right? And everybody else just sort of goes to church, right? But like that's never ever was God's intention.
Yeah.
You know? And that like completely flipped it. That was taken and just molded into the bedrock of the way that I see Christianity and God's people and who God is. And it was awesome, right? It made me love God more and all that stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I'll go ahead. I mean, I'm sure some of you, if not a lot of you, know this passage is that this is Peter writing to a group of people that they're suffering. They're living under oppression. We have in 1 Peter 2:9 that you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Like there's a complete straight, I don't say complete straight line, but there's a through line that you were seeing from, again, the Old Testament, Genesis 1 and 2, to Genesis 6, to Genesis 12, 15, and 17 with Abraham, all the way through Exodus, and even to what Peter is sharing here with New Testament Christians, and even for us here today, that there's the vocation we have as followers of Jesus, as we're being shaped to be more like Jesus, which is himself the reflection and character of God in us, and how we go about living that everywhere that we're at. And so, Dominic, you bring up a good point in that it's not just for pastors. Like every single one of you that has decided to follow Jesus, you have a job to do wherever you are at, and it does not matter a lick of difference whether or not you are in what we would call vocational ministry. If you're working at a church, it has nothing to do with that and everything to do with the DNA of who you are as a disciple of Jesus. And that each of you has a calling wherever you're at, whether you go into education, whether you go into psychology, whether you go into nonprofit work, whether you go into communication, regardless of the field that you're going into, that you go in as a sent disciple, as a representative of Jesus, wherever you're at. And that is both liberating and also terrifying. That especially in our context where to call yourself a Christian, that's a loaded word and puts you lumped in with a whole bunch of people that are waving around signs that God hates certain people are going to hell. And so again, for us that have that calling, the responsibility that we have, that the original intention that what we see in Exodus is also one that we share. And so in order to know, to live out the full meaning of what that means, we got to know the story. And that if we don't know the story of God liberating people, those who were oppressed, that we're going to miss so much of what our responsibility is as disciples of Jesus, not just the fact that God goes and he condescends himself to go and to identify himself with the suffering people in order to liberate them, but oftentimes what is our calling now and which ways are we to reflect God in the world, especially when he identifies himself as one who liberates oppressed peoples. And so, again, for us, it has everything to do with identity, has everything to do with how we treat people, has everything to do with the ways in which we talk with one another, how we talk with people that are out in the streets, how we talk with people that are neighbors, that are friends, family members. And especially right now, it's really hard time to talk to anybody about politics, to talk about religion, again, to talk about really meaning and significant things. And that to love your neighbor now that's revolutionary. We want to change the world, we love people. And not just to say that, yeah, we're going to say everything's okay, but like to really to try to love people and to try to meet people where they're at. That's hard work. Hard work. And so yeah, so you bring up a really great point. I didn't mean to take up so much time, but yeah, it's just so much front loaded in that. So much to talk about there. And again, it's everything having to do with our discipleship in the way that we're pursuing Jesus. And again, but it's here in Exodus that those first underpinnings of what does it mean for God to relate himself to a people, and then how do his people live that out in the context of living in that in relationship with one another. That this is why and how Jesus sums up these two laws of being love God and love your neighbor as you love yourself, because of this initial vision that is that's being conveyed by the Old Testament, that in ways the law is fulfilled. And so again, that we have a lot more details on the Old Testament, but Jesus is right in line with what is going on here in the Old Testament, and the way that the law is fulfilled, and the way that the Hebrews are living out their vocation as kings and priests. And so yeah, in a former life, I was a teaching pastor, so you guys will see that come out a little bit. But yeah, thank you for that, Dominic. It was really good. So yeah, I have rants for days. So other thoughts, comments, concerns? All right, so we got a minute here, so let me go ahead and at least get through Mosaic Covenant before we move on, moving forward. So Mosaic Covenant. The God's going to covenant with Israel in Exodus 20 to 24, and this is going to be referred to as the Mosaic Covenant. So when we refer to Mosaic Covenant, it will be Exodus 20 to 24. Just a heads up, you might see some of these details on a quiz coming up. And this covenant is going to have the shape of ancient Hittite suzerain vassal treaties of the time. If you're wondering what that is, essentially what that means, a suzerain vassal, is that the suzerain would be one who has power, and the vassal would be dependent on the suzerain for protection, to be taken in under their care, to be provided for. But there were certain stipulations that the vassal had to live by. And this is essentially what the Old Testament is trying to get at. Oftentimes called 10 commandments. They're better called 10 words. That's truer to the Hebrew. They're going to be followed by specific rules and stipulations. And over and over and over and over again, what you're going to see is a consistent theme of people over property. People over property. And so Moses will then ratify the covenant, sealing it in blood, the blood of the covenant. And then God's going to come to dwell with the people. And so the rest of Exodus through Leviticus, I know that's reading we all enjoy, especially in Leviticus. But what that details for us is the fact that when we read through tabernacle codes and we read through Levitical codes, there's a temptation to read it as dry, bland literature, which at some point it can feel like it. But what the intention is that it's God teaching his people both how to be his people and how to worship. That it's God teaching his people how to be his people and how to worship. That it's God taking the role of a father to teach his children how they're going to be in relationship. And again, how the approach is meant to be determined by God. Now, they don't just get to pick and choose however they want to. And in the midst of this, we're going to see in Exodus 32 the golden calf incident, which we won't get into here, but there is an incident. And for sake of time, I'll come back over this next week. But are there any questions so far? Comments, concerns, Again, I know we covered a lot, so we had to blow through so much of this. Next week we'll be taking a little bit slower because essentially we're caught up, but I'd rather at least take the time to go through quick than to not go through enough and perpetually be behind. Any questions, comments, concerns, or everybody's afraid that I'm going to go on another 20-minute rant? All right. Well, if you guys are all guys and girls are good. I'll see you all next week. If you have any questions, again, email me, reach out. As a reminder, you guys do have to the end of the day to get that assignment in. If you need more time to send me an email, shoot me an email. I saw that there were a good chunk of people that hadn't turned it in. Do turn in the assignments because these assignments are a good chunk of your grades. So I would hate for you guys to fall behind so early in the semester. And so I'm offering grace to help you guys out. So do take advantage of the grace. And so, yeah, look at the quiz early because there is a reading quiz next week. So do look at that early so know that what's coming up in your reading. So, yeah, if you guys, whatever you guys need anything, just please shoot me an email at my office hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays. So, all right, well, if nothing, you guys are good to go. Sorry for keeping you guys a little bit over.
Thanks, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You guys, you're welcome. You're welcome. See you guys.
Thank you so much, Professor. Have a good day.
You're welcome. See you guys. You guys have a good one too.
See you next week.
All right,
Thank
see ya.
you.
God bless you.
Hey, thanks, man. Appreciate it.